So I'm talking about alternative possibilities and when they are robust, where robustness means that they're capable of grounding responsibility as an alternative possibility. So to situate the discussion, the Frankfurt cases I'm going to be talking about are indeterministic buffer cases. So they're trying to address the indeterministic horn of the dilemma defense, which we talked about last week. And I want to suggest that Pereboom's robustness criterion is too strong, and I'm going to try and put forward, I'm going to put forward a slightly weaker one, and I'm going to try and arrive at that conclusion by a consideration of the nature of ability that's relevant to control. I should add, the response to the Frankfurt cases that I'm going to consider today concedes a lot to the defenders of those cases. And it concedes a lot more than I think you need to concede. So in that respect, it's a useful defence to have because it shows why, I think it shows why, even by their own lights, the proponents of Frankfurt-style cases don't actually have a successful case.
In the indeterministic.
In the indeterministic horn, yeah. But I actually think there's a far more powerful response available, which would render the response I'm considering today redundant. This more powerful response is one considered along the lines of Alvarez's kind of response. I'm not sure whether the two responses are compatible, and for that reason, and because I do endorse the other response, I'm not sure whether I want to endorse this response that I'm going to look at today. But nevertheless, I think it's really useful to consider because it teaches us something, I think, about the nature of control. Maybe if we get time, we can talk about the other response as well in questions or something. Okay, so the main point I want to make is something that came up on Thursday, namely the idea that the ability relevant to control has an epistemic dimension. And this is something that Seth Shabu has recently emphasized with respect to the up to us locution. But others have made similar points. So Alvin Goldman in his 1970 book on action carves out an epistemic notion of ability, and Peter Morris, who has a book on power, also outlines a couple of different notions of epistemic ability. What I want to suggest is that if we accept that the ability or power that's relevant to free will has this epistemic component, this helps us to clarify when alternative possibilities are robust. And then on the back of that, it helps us to provide a response to these indeterministic buffer cases. So, by way of a little bit of background, the leeway view on free will holds that alternative possibilities, qua alternative possibilities, are relevant to free will and moral responsibility. Frankfurt's formulation of this requirement with respect to moral responsibility was that a person is morally responsible for what he has done only if he could have done otherwise. So if we suppose that someone does A and is responsible for A-ing, then according to the leeway theorist, he was able to A and he was able to do otherwise. So the leeway theorist is committed to at least some kind of dual or plural ability or power. I think that there are at least three questions that it's important to ask about this PAP-like principle, PAP itself and related principles. First, what does the phrase "what he has done" mean? So what's the scope of that phrase? Is it meant to cover only actions or also their consequences, maybe omissions as well? And is the plausibility dependent on various different theories of action? Second, what's the relevant sense of able? And especially, what's the kind of possibility that's being affirmed in that use of able? And the third, what counts as doing otherwise? The considerations that I'm looking at today focus mainly on the second and a little bit on the third question. So, my main claim, as I said, is that the relevant sense of able has an epistemic dimension. So, to say this is to say that the options available to an agent are in part a function of his beliefs. So I think that some of the epistemic conditions that we've talked about in various contexts should be seen as part of the conditions on control rather than separable conditions. So to make this idea plausible or to hopefully motivate it a little bit, consider the following examples. So first example is what I call coffee or tea. So Jim decides each afternoon whether to have coffee or tea in his break. Today Jim faces the same decision, but unbeknownst to him, someone has drugged the coffee such that if he consumes it, his skin is going to turn bright purple. Right? I think that the correct way to analyse or think about this kind of example would be to say that Jim is able or has the power, in the sense relevant to free will, to choose tea, and he has the same power, the same sense of power to choose coffee. Okay, but he doesn't have the power in that same sense to turn his skin purple. Intuitively, we would just say that this is something that lies outside of his control, I think. And we could phrase this using the up to us locution. So it's up to Jim whether he has coffee, it's up to him whether he has tea, but it's not up to him whether he turns his skin purple or whether his skin turns purple. And the important point is that Jim seems to lack this power ability precisely because he doesn't know that he could act in such a way that it would then bring it about that his skin turns purple. The last phrase?
What you just said,
yeah, so the crucial thing that I guess I'm trying to emphasize is that he lacks the power or ability in the relevant sense precisely because he doesn't know that he can act in such a way that this result will occur. I should maybe say, I'm using the word know to refer to some kind of epistemic condition. I guess it's not going to require knowledge. It's going to require some kind of justified belief that's reasonable or tracks the evidence in some way, perhaps. I'm just kind of using that as a placeholder. I don't think anything I say turns on it being knowledge or not knowledge. One thing that helps to maybe make this point clearer is that if Jim was to learn that he could act in such a way that his skin would turn purple, then it seems that he just gains control over that effect or that outcome just by adding that bit of knowledge or that bit of belief. In effect, turning his skin purple would become a possible intentional action for Jim if he had that knowledge. And so that's why I think it's important to see this as part of the control condition, because it becomes something that he can then do. So here's another example. If I have a normal deck of cards face down on the table in front of me, I have the power in the relevant sense to pick a card from the deck, but I don't have the power in the relevant sense to pick a queen, because I just don't know which cards are the queens. And again, if I was to learn which ones were the queens, then I would gain the power in the relevant sense. So to accept this view is to accept a strong demand on the relevant ability and the ability that's going to be involved in the ability to do otherwise. So many people have noted that, it's not enough that we just find any old alternatives in, for example, the Frankfurt cases. And what Seth Shabu has recently pointed out is that, well, it's not even enough to find any old ability either. We need an alternative which has the right kind of ability. And this kind of ability, this up-to-usness, if you like, is a strong kind of ability because it requires that the person know what they're bringing about.
Where is that? Which paper is that?
He has two papers on this. So the main one is it wasn't up to Jones, and that's where he draws out various points about. So he argues that the up to us locution is intentional.
Right. Oh,
that kind of stuff. Yeah, it is Phil Studies. Yeah, okay. And he has one also with David Hunt called "The Insignificance of Timing."
Right.
Also Phil Studies, I think. Yeah. So I accept this requirement as Seth has argued for it. He thinks this is a problem for people who object to the Frankfurt cases. He thinks it makes the job harder. I actually don't think that's the case. I think, if anything, it because it focuses on what the right kind of ability is, it in some sense makes the job easier because it helps us to see where we need to look. So I want to try and show that we can find the relative alternative where the agent does have this kind of strong ability. So that's how I think this is going to connect with the issue of robustness. To talk about this stuff, I'm going to introduce Pereboom's tax evasion case, and then I'll say how Pereboom analyzes it, and I'll just briefly go over Pereboom's robustness criterion, and then I'll say why I think it's too strong and how we can address that. Okay, so the tax evasion case is an indeterministic Frankfurt buffer case, and so it attempts to get around the dilemma defense by embracing the indeterministic horn, and it's meant to work as follows. So we have the character Joe, and he's the victim, if you like. He's the person who's going to be subject to intervention. He's deciding whether or not to claim an illegal tax deduction. We're told that Joe is in large part self-interested. He knows that he'll probably get away with claiming the tax deduction, and he knows that the penalty wouldn't actually be that bad even if he did get caught. We're told that for Joe to choose not to evade taxes, he would first have to consider the moral reasons for doing so. He can attend to these moral reasons voluntarily, but attending to these moral reasons is only necessary and not sufficient for deciding not to evade taxes. So the idea is that after attending to the reasons, Joe would then have to go and make a libertarian free decision, if you like, to not evade taxes. However, Black, who's the intervener, is set up such that he can detect when Joe considers these moral reasons, and he knows that this is something that has to happen before Joe can decide not to evade taxes, so he can use this to intervene. Pereboom says the following of this case. So he thinks that if Joe attends to the moral reasons, then Joe will not bear any moral responsibility. But this is because when Joe does attend to the moral reasons, the intervener is going to use this to intervene, and so effectively the intervener is just going to take over. So once that happens, Joe is no longer acting freely, so he's not responsible. According to Pereboom, this alternative possibility is not robust, and that's precisely because Joe is unaware of the Frankfurt setup. So thus, Joe doesn't know that by considering the moral reasons, he's going to cause the intervener to intervene, and therefore he will be absolved of moral responsibility. So Joe doesn't know any of that. Others have also suggested that the alternative possibility is not robust, even considered apart from the intervener, because Joe's considering moral reasons is only a necessary condition on not evading taxes. So because Joe would still have to make this libertarian choice, the considering of moral reasons in and of itself does not guarantee, it's not directly relevant to Joe's evading taxes, because it doesn't guarantee that he would avoid evading taxes. So this is something I think that Hunt and Shabu push in their paper. So Pereboom concludes that the alternative is not robust, and in one of his papers, which I think is one of his later papers, so he might actually be working with a slightly different variation of the case, he puts forward the following criterion for robustness. So I'm going to read this out. It's quite a long criterion. My focus is only on one bit of it. So he says, for an agent to have a robust alternative for her immoral action, A, that is, an alternative relevant per se to explaining why she is blameworthy for A, it must be that A, she instead could have voluntarily acted or refrained from acting, as a result of which she would be blameless, and B, that for at least one such acting or refraining, she is cognitively sensitive to its being available to her, with the result that she believes to some significant degree that had she voluntarily acted in that way, she would or would likely be blameless. So the idea is that she needs to have an action available to her that she could escape blame, and she needs to know that she's got that action available to her. So the key line that I want to focus on is the idea that the agent must be able to act in a way that would render her blameless, or would, in all likelihood, render her blameless. This is the main point I want to challenge. What I want to suggest first is that there are other ways that Joe's knowledge might affect robustness. And in particular, I think we need to ask the following question of these kind of examples. And so of the tax evasion case, we need to ask the following question. Does Joe know that by considering moral reasons, something he can voluntarily do, he will put himself in a position to decide not to evade taxes? And I think that the response to the buffer cases that the libertarian can push should depend on the answer to this question. That is, I think that the defender of PAP has a different response available depending on what the answer to that question is. So, if we take first the response that Joe does know. So, suppose that Joe does know that by considering moral reasons, he will then put himself in a position to make a libertarian decision where he could not evade taxes. My contention is that if Joe has this knowledge, then considering moral reasons is, or at least could be, a robust alternative for Joe. This is not because he's in a Frankfurt case where the intervener is set up such that if he considers moral reasons, he'll be absolved of all blame because of the intervener's actions. Right? I agree with Pereboom that the alternative is not robust for that reason. But I think there could be another reason why it's robust, and that's that the considering moral reasons is a means or a first step, if you like, to his not evading taxes, and it's stipulated that he knows that. So Joe knows that he has that first step available. So it's true, even on this view, that considering moral reasons doesn't guarantee that he'll not evade taxes. But I think this point is just irrelevant, and I want to try and make this clear with an analogy, which I hope would illustrate this point. So suppose you're deciding what to have for dessert, and you know that there's chocolate ice cream available, and you know that there are some other options available, but you don't know what they are. Right? But you can find out what they are by asking for a menu. After which you would then have to make a libertarian decision about what to have for dessert. Right? And you can still choose to have the chocolate ice cream even if you ask for a menu. Right, now, if you go ahead and choose the chocolate ice cream without asking for a menu, then it seems like you're responsible for choosing. And that's you have a robust alternative because you could ask for a menu and then you could make this further decision. And the robustness doesn't seem to hinge on the fact that you could then make the further decision. Like if someone intervenes as you're asking for the menu, that just seems neither here nor there. You had a route available to not choosing the chocolate ice cream and you decided to not take it. And that's, I think, what makes the alternative robust. It's nothing to do with being able to guarantee various outcomes. And it's on this basis that I want to suggest a slightly weaker robustness criterion. And this goes roughly as follows. So this is a kind of gloss on it. I don't intend this to be a finished formulation. But I want to say something like an alternative possibility is robust if in realizing that alternative, the agent does not incur any additional blame to that already incurred. Okay? So the idea is that instead of being able to secure blamelessness with respect to some particular thing, the agent just needs to be able to not incur any additional blameworthiness. So the basic idea is this. Acting is usually a process, right? A stretch of extended activity. And because the thing that we're usually interested in when it comes to responsibility is the result of that process, it's just too strong to require that at each and every point during the process, the agent should be able to secure or guarantee a particular outcome of the whole process. That just seems like not really true to how acting is and how acting works. So I think that what we should demand instead is that the agent be able, from moment to moment, to act in such a way that they don't incur any additional blame. And that's the kind of crux of the idea that I hope to be able to flesh out into a slightly weaker, more nuanced robustness criterion. This kind of reply is quite similar to the timing objection that has been offered against the buffer cases, which has been pushed by Chris Franklin and David Palmer independently. Very briefly, the timing objection says that the alternative we've been talking about in the Joe case is robust because it enables Joe to avoid deciding to evade taxes at a particular time, t. Right? But as I understand it anyway, and I think this is one of the main criticisms that's been levelled against the timing objection, it depends on adding a temporal index to the content of our responsibility judgments. So it relies on saying, well, Joe had this robust alternative, and what it allowed him to do was avoid deciding to evade taxes at T1. So that's what he avoids responsibility for, deciding at T1. And people have found that implausible because it seems like we just don't include those kind of temporal indexes on our responsibility judgments. And I think that I hope that the idea I've presented might allow us to present a better robustness criterion, but avoid temporally indexing the responsibility judgments, because we're not saying that you have to avoid deciding taxes at this time and also at this time. We're rather just saying it's kind of like an ongoing thing. What the person has to be able to do is just act such that they don't incur any blame. So that's my hope for this kind of suggestion. Okay, so that deals with the case where Joe does know that the intermediary step is a means to his end. What about if he doesn't know this? So what about when Joe knows that he can voluntarily consider moral reasons, but he doesn't know that he needs to do this in order to decide not to evade taxes? I think that the libertarian has a response to this kind of part of the dilemma, if this is how we flesh out the case more fully. And what I want to say is just that Joe's responsibility here is going to depend on whether he's responsible for the character traits which lead to his evading taxes. So the way I would want to think about this way of fleshing out the case is that it's a case where what appears to be doing most of the work in producing Joe's decision for evading taxes is his character traits and dispositions. It's his kind of selfishness, his belief that he's not going to get caught, it's that kind of thing. He hasn't really made a decision in the strong sense, I think, that the way libertarians think about decisions. The sense in which he's made a decision is the sense in which he has acquired or formed an intention to evade taxes. And if that's what's doing the work, then I think it's going to be fair to just treat this as a case of derivative responsibility. So to illustrate this kind of defense, consider the limiting case, right? So suppose that Joe's not subject to any Frankfurt interveners, it's time to complete his tax return, and he just goes ahead and evades taxes without thinking, as we might say. So his evading taxes just flows from his character with no deliberation, no conscious decision. In that case, I think it's going to be clear that whether he's responsible is just going to depend on whether he's responsible for the character traits. It seems like a straightforward case of derivative responsibility. And so what I want to claim is that if it's plausible for the libertarian to treat that limiting case as one of derivative responsibility, then it should also be plausible to treat the second way of fleshing out the tax evasion as a case of derivative responsibility. So that concludes how I want to deal with these kind of buffer cases. I'm going to stop there because that's 25 minutes. So if we want to talk about the other alternative response, we can do that in questions, but see what people think.
Just to clarify, so when the answer is no, that is when Joe doesn't know, then you treat it like a standard case of ignorance, is that it? And so you agree kind of with Rosen that when you have ignorance, it's a matter of tracing back to some prior But maybe not acrasia, but at least you have to.
It wouldn't have to be ignorance, maybe. Just he's got a character which results in him evading taxes. Is he responsible?
Oh, okay.
Depends if he's responsible for the character.
Yeah. But it's ignorance in the sense that he doesn't know. He has ignorance about.
He has ignorance about the moral reasons and what they might lead to. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And so, your criterion of robustness is that the agent must have it in his power to do something else, such that in doing it he wouldn't be incurring any more blameworthiness, let's say, than he already has. And he knows that. Is that it?
Yes, he knows that.
He knows
that. Strong sense of up to us power.
Would that mean? Yeah, I guess. Let's see. Somehow, I mean, I'm trying. I want to think more about it, but somehow the idea or that formulation doesn't naturally suggest robustness, or to me, I mean, I'd have to think more about it. In other words, I see how if someone says, well, the agent must be able to avoid authorship or avoid blameworthiness, and he must know that, that suggests he has this big deal kind of power, so it's a robust. But your formulation, maybe it still works, but maybe I'll just have to think more about it.
I guess the intuitive idea is that he should just be able to do something which is maybe the least bad option or something like that. He should be able to do...
I see.
Yeah, that's the kind of... So my idea was that maybe some people think that, suppose you're deliberating over this, some people might think that, well, if you really think about evading taxes a lot, then you're blameworthy for that, even if you end up not evading taxes. Like the fact that you just didn't decide, the fact that it was even a live option for you, you might be blameworthy for. So what I get, the reason I put it like that was to hopefully cope with those kind of situations somewhere where someone might be minimally blameworthy just for really treating it as a serious option. So if they focus their attention on whether they should evade taxes, they weigh up the pros and cons, they've already incurred some amount of blameworthiness, even if they haven't. So then the idea was that, well, going forward, what they need to be able to do is just avoid incurring any more. But it would be unreasonable to think that, or to demand that they need to be able to just straight off secure that they have no blameworthiness for the action in question. Because that just doesn't seem true to how we make decisions and how we come to various actions and intentions to act.
How do you take your view? I mean, it seems like your way of responding to Paraboom is similar to Chris Franklin's. How do you take it to be different?
So the difference, I think, would revolve around the not having to say that the responsibility judgment includes this temporal index, like as part of the judgment.
Okay. So you take it that he defends that.
I think that's one way, at least, of fleshing out the timing objection.
Oh yeah, definitely the timing objection. I wasn't sure that in all his work he emphasizes or defends the timing objection. I thought that part of what Chris Franklin was doing was just to emphasize that in Joe's case, he, as it were, voluntarily omits to consider moral reasons, and it's in virtue of that he's responsible. So it's not so much, so in that, I mean, maybe he also has something on the timing objection. He also does it.
Yeah.
But in that case, I forget whether he also says that in that context, Joe doesn't just omit or voluntarily omit considering, but it's in a context where he realizes that if he were to consider it, that would put him in a position to, but okay.
Yeah, so that point's going to be the same.
That would be the same.
Yeah, because it relies on the knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
But one difference maybe, you then go back to reformulate a robustness condition to reflect that intuition, which I don't remember. I don't think Chris did.
No, I would have to go back to his paper, but he makes a couple of points, and yeah. So my point is going to be a lot more similar to that other point that he makes, rather than
Yes. Okay.
I found part of the way you responded to John helpful, because I initially had the way you were phrasing the condition at first, it didn't intuitively seem like that was a big deal, but then you just reworded it and I was like, oh yeah, because I see how it's related to the not necessary to avoid blame. It's a weaker condition than that, but obviously it's entailed by, if you actually avoid blame, then you're not increasing the blame.
Yes,
Entailed is going the other direction, but it's along the same route. It's just weaker, which is what you want. I had a really general question. So this is not a technical question about these examples, but you want the knowledge component to be sort of crucial. Like it's an epistemic, not an epistemic condition, but you're focusing on knowledge. Does it matter that if you know something, then it's true? And you might think, well, the knowledge is kind of tracking this independent fact, and so maybe it should be cast in terms of that independent fact of
so
being able to do it. So if you know that you can do it, then it's true that you can do it. So you can do it. So why just talk about knowing?
Well, you would have to talk. So I don't want it to rely on knowing as opposed to some other epistemic criterion.
Right, but you mean at least believe it and it's true.
Yeah. The reason, because you need the belief component, because there are other things which might be true that you can bring about. Right. So that was why it's important to focus on that. And it's important to underline that that's part of the control condition. That's what I took the relevance of that to be.
Yeah, and I don't have like a criticism that hinges on that. I was just wondering if there's something interesting about knowledge, or that you need belief and truth. So you believe it and it's true. Well, yeah, right. It's just being true wouldn't be enough. Yeah, you can't just focus on that. You need to believe it.
And some interesting things might happen when the belief isn't true, but there's enough of a pathway for you to start doing something which you think is up to you, but actually it wouldn't be up to you, like the end result wouldn't be up to you, but you could begin down that route, because then that would seem like a robust alternative, even if you couldn't realize the end result.
I think it's really interesting, nice paper. But is this right that even if, so you might have thought, going back to Aristotle, that there are these two separate conditions on responsibility, a knowledge condition and a control condition, and you might have thought, here you're taking the control condition to be freedom to do otherwise. You might have thought that the control condition doesn't have an epistemic component, but upon reflection you want to argue does have an epistemic component. And but that then you might think, you don't need the separate epistemic condition, but I think that wouldn't follow. Yeah, right. So you're okay with, because even if control has an epistemic component, you still might need this separate. Yeah, because it deals with a different kind of epistemic.
Yeah. So maybe epistemic, I don't know, beliefs about what's right and wrong.
Yeah, or even
they're going to be conditions.
Understanding. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. So there may be other epistemic.
Yeah.
But is there? Let's see. So, right. In a case like a simpler, or a case where you're told you can drink coffee or tea, you want to say you have it in your power either to drink coffee or tea. It's up to you. But unbeknownst to you, things are hooked up so that if you drink coffee, your skin will turn purple. Was that it? So now it's not up to you whether your skin turns purple. So in that sense, in an epistemic sense of power, you don't have it in your power.
Yeah.
What if could you accommodate the phenomena by just pushing that into the epistemic criterion? What if you said, well, you do have it in your power to cause your skin to turn purple, Just like you have it in your power when you turn on the light to detonate a bomb. It's just that it's not, oh, thank you. It's not, oh, is that for you or for me? Oh, okay, thank you. It's just that it's not reasonable to expect that by turning on the light you would be detonating the bomb, or it's not we can't expect you to know, but it literally is in your power, but now you want to further work now. More work is being done by the epistemic condition. I mean, is there something to be said in pushing these into the power part?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess, so in holding that the relevant sense of power has the epistemic component, I don't have to hold that there isn't another sense which doesn't. I guess it seems just more complicated to separate them when some of these cases clearly seem to suggest that it is about power and it's about control. Especially when you phrase it in terms of control, it really seems to be clear that the knowledge affects what you're able to control. Yeah. So then, if it's possible to treat it as one thing, then that would seem to make sense. And I guess another way of motivating might be that, well, even for our most, really simple actions, they need some knowledge. Yeah. It's not like it would probably be really difficult to carve out a notion of power which doesn't invoke any epistemic criteria. Yeah. Right, so turning on the light switch, well, I need to know where the light switch is, and all those kind of beliefs. And then there's the know-how that I have, which is many people take to be another kind of knowledge, also important for that power. So if those senses of power already have some epistemic criterion in, which maybe just hasn't been focused on, then why not just build all of it in?
That's definitely interesting. One thing to think about is whether up to usness and power attributions work like attributions of intentional action, where intentional with a T, but those set up intentional context. So if I say, I intentionally drank the coffee, that seems right, even though it does seem wrong to say I intentionally turned my skin purple. But I mean, even though that was what happened, so there's an intentional context there. I intentionally drank the coffee, but I did not intentionally turn my skin purple. I'm not quite sure. My intuition isn't as firm with up to usness. Like, I'm inclined, you could push me to say, well, it was up to you whether your skin turned purple. It was up to you whether you drank the coffee, and so it was up to you whether your skin turned purple. But I do see, you could go either way on that, I think. So, okay.
With the intentional language, that really makes sense to sort of cash out why you can't do it intentionally. So you can change your skin purple, but you don't know that you can. So, and you do it, but you didn't do it intentionally because you didn't know that you could. But and this gets back to the point I was trying to make, and I don't really know what the point is, so it's difficult to make. But if you wanted to say he lacks the ability to turn his skin purple because he doesn't know that he can, right? But the reason he doesn't know that he can is just because it's not true, which is to say that he can't do it. It's not true that he can do it, and that's why he doesn't know it. He might believe it. Right? He might believe he could do it, but he still wouldn't know it because it's not true. So it seems like it just kind of collapses back into, he can't do it because he can't do it. He can't do it because he doesn't know it, but he doesn't know it because it's not true, which is to say he can't do it. So you just... Well, I don't know, is that related at all to what you're talking about?
Maybe, but...
I don't think this affects your position, really. I just thought that's an odd way to phrase that particular case, to say it's really about the knowing. That's why he can't change his skin purple.
But there is something that he can do which will have that result. Right? And if he knows which action it is, then he could do it in the relevant sense of could, in the up to us sense.
Okay, so he can change his skin purple in some sense. That's the idea?
Oh yeah, so okay. When I carve out this notion of up to us, or this strong sense of ability or power, that has this epistemic component, and that's the one I'm saying is relevant to free will. It's not like I'm saying there isn't another sense of could, right, which doesn't require the epistemic. That's the same kind of could that if you turn on a light switch and it sets off a bomb or disturbs however many molecules, well, I can do it in some sense, but that's not the sense that's going to be relevant.
So, but in the case where you can't change it just intuitively, you can't, like all of us, we can't change our skin purple.
Yeah.
Although in fact you can, right, in some sense. But let's say you can't do it as a direct action. There, do you want to say that the best way to capture the sense of our lack of ability is to explain it in terms of our lack of knowledge?
Oh, I see what you mean. No, probably not. No.
Okay, that didn't seem the most
Because
natural way.
so the knowledge isn't the only thing to this
Yes.
strong sense of ability.
Mm-hmm.
It's just one component. So there'll be other criterions as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Other comments that people have or questions? I was curious, what was the other criticism that you said?
So the other criticism revolves around claiming that the Frankfurt cases just fail in their demand to meet the kind of conceptual requirements, I guess, that they need to, which is that in both sequences you have an action of the same type, and the reason that they try to resist that move is because in the alternative sequence the person is caused or determined in a way that has to ensure that they couldn't not do the action of that type, because otherwise it wouldn't be inevitable in the right sense. And so the idea would just be, well, we either shouldn't call that an action, or we should just, if we call it an action, then maybe we should just limit the scope of PAP to things that you do on your own, or however you want to phrase it. I find this really powerful and persuasive, but I think a lot of people seem to dismiss it because they seem to think it's just obvious that you could act in a deterministic world. And to motivate it and to make it plausible requires a lot of background, and it requires a lot of kind of action theory. But I mean, the basic thing could be really simple. So it's straightforward that if you attach strings to someone's limbs and then move them about, right? You wouldn't be causing that person to move their limbs. You would be causing their limbs to move, but you would not be causing them to move their limbs.
I see.
Right? And so we often get this confused because some verbs like move have both a transitive and an intransitive sense, and we can get them confused, and we think that we can describe things in the intransitive sense, like your limbs are moving, and then we tend to think, oh well, that person, maybe they're moving their limbs, and then we've got an action. Right? And so the central thought would be, well, why should we allow that move when we're talking about decisions, right? So if Black manipulates Jones's brain in such a way that causes it to be so-and-so, why think that should count as a decision in the sense that we're interested in the sense that's going to be a locus of responsibility? Maybe it counts as them coming to have an intention of a certain kind, the same way that if you attach strings to someone's limbs and then move them, that would count as someone's limbs being moved, but it doesn't count as them moving their limbs. So there's a question over whether it's legitimate in the thought experiment to just stipulate that in this alternative sequence Black is able to cause a decision. It's just so that's not straightforward, I take it. And then
I'm sorry. Is this, though, is your reply within a framework that presupposes that the Frankfurt cases work by showing that in the alternative sequence you'd have the same thing as rather than this other framework that I was suggesting might be more profitable, where it's not that what's going on is in Frankfurt cases you have access only to alternative possibilities where the same thing happens, but rather you don't have access to an alternative possibility in which something else happens.
Sorry, do you mean the response I've talked about today, or
or the second thing?
The second response isn't committed to that kind of worry that we were talking about, because so this line is pushed by a couple of people, but Alvarez has a 2009 paper where it's really detailed. She does not think that you need to have the same particular token action in both sequences. She's happy to say it just needs to be an action of the same type. So I don't think she's open to the same kind of worries that you were raising for the kind of Van Inwagen response.
Even, I mean, what I was thinking in my reply to Tim O'Connor, that agent causation paper, what I'm willing to say is you don't even need an action of the same type. You just need, because of the what I call the Fisher type examples, where you could actually be pulverized in the alternative sequence. So but that would still show that you can't do otherwise. But not because you would be doing an action of the same type.
Right, yeah. So this is where Alvarez's second move would come in, which relies on saying that it's just too strong to demand the person perform another positive action.
Right.
All you need is that the person could have refrained. Right? Okay. And if the person could have refrained...
By being pulverized.
Well, so they act,
Yeah.
and if that action is up to them, then they could have not acted. Right. And I guess the question would be, how is the Fisher case going to, what's going to be the trigger for the Fisher case? Right. So the person can be pulverized, but it needs to be based on some kind of trigger. And that's going to be the beginning of their refraining or something like that, or...
I don't want to set it up as a prior sign, but yeah, it would have to, I mean, because you can refrain either voluntarily or just involuntarily, and I think one would need a voluntary refraining.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this is good. This is good. So going back, could I go back to your main? I mean, your main critique. I just want to understand. So what you did was you presented an alternative conception of robustness, and what you want to say is that will in fact be met in Joe in the tax evasion case, but. And you didn't address yourself to other Frankfurt cases like deterministic versions, but so I just wanted to ask, you don't, when I think about the deterministic versions, as I've run the argument, you end up with alternative possibilities, but they're not robust, but they won't, I don't think they'll meet your criterion for robustness, but the problem, I take it, you would perhaps find the problem somewhere else. Yeah. Okay.
I suspect I would. Yeah.
Yes.
I haven't thought about how they'd apply to the deterministic cases, but I would suspect that I would just want to reject the deterministic cases before we get to that bit of the dialectic. Okay. Yeah.
So you might want to look at that 2010 paper in the Phil Review, and then responses to Whitaker and analysis. But I think that's probably the way. Yeah. Okay, anything else? Okay, good. Let me just, thank you, that was great. We got a little time, we won't take it all up, I just take a couple minutes to say thank you to all of you, especially to Anton and Artum for all your help in supporting this. Yeah. Also, I know, I mean, I was really impressed with all the presentations. They were really good and thoughtful, and I appreciate all the contributions everyone's made, and everyone had a really good spirit about the whole thing, very friendly, and so I learned a lot. I hope you learned a lot. And I think the arrangement is, from here, it's completely voluntary, but if you want to send me a draft of a paper, I'd be very happy to give you comments, and I'll reflect on, I mean, if it's a paper that I think Matt should see as well, I'll send it to Matt. But, you know, I won't send all the papers to Matt. But, you know, or if you decide that you think Matt should be the first one to see it, just send it to Matt first if you think it's appropriate. But, and I will say that, you know, because we now know each other, in the future, if you have a paper that you would like me to look at, or you want me to look at part of your dissertation or something, I would be very happy to do that. I can't always guarantee that I'll immediately reply, but you know, I will make an effort to read your work, and I really appreciate that you came here and spent these 2 weeks with us. I also want to thank Matt, who I thought just really did a wonderful job. Okay, any further? Okay. I think we're done. Okay, so now people are leaving tomorrow morning, and maybe some people this afternoon, I don't know, but I know we're leaving tomorrow afternoon. So we'll see you at lunch and at dinner, and okay.